On a cold February night in 2021, the streets of New Haven, Connecticut were shattered by the sound of gunfire. A Yale graduate student, full of promise, love, and a future ahead of him, was ambushed and shot to death in the middle of a quiet neighborhood. Within moments, a community would be left reeling, and investigators would find themselves untangling a mystery that blended love, jealousy, and shocking betrayal. The victim was Kevin Jiang, a 26-year-old student at Yale's School of the Environment. He wasn't just another name in the headlines. Kevin was a U.S. Army veteran, a man of deep faith, and someone who friends described as kind, joyful, and full of life. Just 1 week earlier, he had proposed to his girlfriend, a brilliant fellow student, and she had said yes. His future looked bright, but on that night, all of it was ripped away in seconds. The crime unfolded like something out of a nightmare. Kevin's car, a silver Prius, was rear-ended near an intersection. Witnesses later recalled hearing what sounded like a fender bender. Kevin stepped out of his car, most likely expecting to exchange insurance information with the other driver. Instead, he walked directly into an ambush. Within moments, a man in a dark SUV opened fire. The first shot struck Kevin, knocking him down. Then, in an act that police would later describe as chillingly personal, the shooter stood over him and continued firing at close range. By the time the gunfire stopped, Kevin had been shot multiple times. Neighbors who heard the shots rushed to their windows. Some caught glimpses of a dark SUV speeding away into the night. Others described the terror of hearing gunfire so close to home. The Yale community quickly learned the devastating truth that one of their own, a young scholar with a promising future, had been murdered just blocks from campus. At first, police wondered if this was road rage, a random confrontation that spiraled out of control. But the details didn't add up. The shooter hadn't just fired and fled. He had made sure Kevin wouldn't survive. The precision, the number of shots, and the brutal execution-style approach suggested something far more personal. As detectives examined the scene, they discovered 45 caliber shell casings scattered across the pavement. This wasn't just any gun. It was the same caliber weapon linked to a string of unsolved shootings in New Haven over the previous months. Now, those earlier incidents suddenly seemed connected. But why would a Yale student, a man with no criminal ties, end up as the only person killed? This was more than a tragic shooting. It was the beginning of a case that would cross state lines, draw in one of the nation's most prestigious universities, and expose the dark obsession of a man who simply couldn't let go. To understand the shock of Kevin Jiang's murder, you first need to know who he was. Kevin wasn't just a Yale student. He was a young man who seemed to embody both determination and kindness. Born in Chicago, he grew up with strong values, rooted in his faith and a deep bond with his mother. He had served in the Army National Guard, and those who knew him described him as disciplined but also gentle. He loved the outdoors, science, and helping others. By early 2021, Kevin was studying at Yale's School of the Environment, preparing for a future where he could merge science with service. He wasn't someone wrapped up in prestige or competition. Classmates said he was humble, approachable, and quick to offer encouragement. To friends, he was the type of person who smiled easily and made others feel at ease. But what defined him most in those last months was love. Kevin had met Zion Perry, a bright and accomplished student pursuing her PhD in molecular biophysics. Their connection was immediate and genuine. They bonded over science, faith, and their shared sense of purpose. To friends, Kevin was smitten, always talking about Zion, always eager to share his joy. In early February, Kevin and Zion had taken the next step. He proposed to her, and she said yes. On social media, they posted pictures of the engagement, glowing with happiness. It was a turning point. Two promising young people, ready to build a life together. For Kevin, it was everything he dreamed of. A partner, a future, and a reason to keep pushing forward. And yet, that very joy may have drawn someone's envy. Investigators would later discover a surprising connection between Zion and another man, one who had once moved in the same academic circles and who was quietly harboring dangerous feelings. That man was Ching-Xuan Pan, an MIT graduate student living hundreds of miles away. At the time, Kevin had no reason to suspect anything. He was living in New Haven, working on his degree and caring for his mother, who relied on his support. Friends and neighbors saw him as a man whose life was coming together beautifully. But behind the scenes, something dark was forming. The shooter wasn't random, and the clues, from the SUV to the shell casings, would eventually reveal that Kevin was caught in the crosshairs of a calculated plan. For now, though, all anyone knew was that Kevin Jiang, a man who had dedicated his life to faith, family, and future, had been gunned down in cold blood. The why was still hidden, but detectives were about to pull on threads that led straight into the past, threads that would unravel a story of obsession and betrayal. Saturday, February 6th, 2021, started out like any other winter day in New Haven. The streets were quiet, the cold air heavy, and students at Yale were going about their routines. For Kevin Jiang, the day likely felt like just another step toward his future. He was newly engaged, optimistic, and busy with his studies. But by that evening, everything would change. Around 8 p.m., reports of gunfire ripped through the East Rock neighborhood. The sound of multiple shots echoed against the buildings, followed by silence. When police arrived, they found a scene that would haunt even the most seasoned detectives. Kevin's silver Prius sat in the road with its hazard lights blinking. Behind it, marks on the bumper suggested a collision, just enough of an impact to make Kevin stop. Witnesses later described seeing a dark SUV pull up behind the Prius, bump it, and then wait. Kevin got out, most likely to check the damage and approach the other driver. It was the kind of everyday situation people face all the time. A simple fender bender, the kind where you exchange insurance and move on. But instead of conversation, there was gunfire. The first shots struck Kevin at close range. Witnesses heard the crack of gunfire and then saw the flash of muzzle light from inside the SUV. Kevin collapsed to the ground, but the attack didn't stop there. The shooter stepped out, stood over Kevin, and fired again, delivering multiple shots directly into his body. 8 shell casings littered the pavement. Forensic experts would later note stippling burns on Kevin's head and chest. Marks left when bullets are fired from near point-blank range. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a random drive-by. It was execution. Neighbors who peeked from their windows saw flashes, heard Kevin scream, and then counted more shots. Some described the terrifying moment of realizing someone was still shooting, even as the victim lay motionless. Then, just as quickly as it began, the dark SUV sped off into the night, leaving Kevin's body behind. Kevin's fiancée, Zion, would learn of his death only hours later. She had no idea why someone would target the man she loved. To those who knew Kevin, the idea that he had enemies seemed impossible. But detectives knew they weren't just dealing with a random act of violence. The use of a .45 caliber weapon matched several earlier shootings in the city. And those weren't accidents either. They were targeted, planned, and strangely connected. Now, Kevin's death seemed to be part of a bigger picture, and the question loomed larger than ever. Was Kevin in the wrong place at the wrong time, or had someone deliberately set out to kill him? When investigators first arrived at the crime scene, they had little more than shell casings, eyewitness accounts, and a gut feeling that this was no random shooting. The precision, the close-range execution, it all suggested something deeply personal. But why Kevin? Detectives combed through the casings and quickly noticed something chilling. The .45 caliber shells matched those from a string of unsolved shootings in New Haven just weeks earlier. In each case, homes had been sprayed with bullets, yet no one was hurt. Random violence, maybe. But now, with Kevin's murder, the pattern looked deliberate. Someone had been practicing, testing, and preparing for something bigger. Witnesses reported the same detail over and over, a dark SUV fleeing the scene. That description matched reports from the earlier shootings, but SUVs are everywhere. Investigators needed more. That night, they pulled security footage from a neighbor's camera. The video was grainy, distorted by reflections, but the sounds were unmistakable. First, the crunch of a minor collision. Then, Kevin's Prius stopping with its hazards flashing, a shadowy SUV backing into frame. Kevin walking toward it. 2 gunshots, a scream, then 6 more. Seconds later, the SUV disappearing into the darkness. It was horrifying to watch, but it confirmed what detectives already feared. This was an ambush. From there, the search turned to Kevin's life. Detectives interviewed his mother, his friends, and most importantly, his fiancée, Zion Perry. They wanted to know if Kevin had any enemies or if anyone in his orbit might want to harm him. Everyone described Kevin the same way, kind, genuine, without a mean bone in his body. Zion herself was devastated, unable to think of anyone who would target him. But as police dug into Zion's connections, a name surfaced, one that seemed out of place. On her Facebook friends list, detectives spotted Ching-Suan Pan, a graduate student at MIT. On the surface, he had nothing to do with Kevin. But as investigators looked closer, a troubling picture began to form. Pan was brilliant, but socially awkward. He had once known Zion through academic circles. Friends later said he harbored feelings for her, feelings that were never returned. When Zion got engaged to Kevin, Pan might have seen it as a final rejection. To detectives, this opened up a possible motive: jealousy, obsession, and the inability to let go. Meanwhile, Pan himself was already drawing suspicion. Just hours after Kevin's death, police encountered him in Connecticut, stranded in a dark SUV stuck on railroad tracks. At the time, officers didn't know about the murder. They helped him out, gave him a ride to a hotel, and let him go. Only later did they realize they had unknowingly come face to face with the prime suspect. It was a haunting detail. The killer had been right there, almost within their grasp. And now, he was on the run. After Kevin's murder, the case escalated quickly from a local homicide to a nationwide manhunt. Detectives now had a name: Ching-Suan Pan, the MIT graduate student connected to Kevin's fiancée Zion. But by the time police pieced it together, Pan was gone. U.S. Marshals joined the search. Investigators learned that Pan had access to large sums of money, millions, possibly from family resources, and that he was using it to stay hidden. He was also incredibly methodical. Before the murder, he had test-driven cars, disabling GPS trackers to avoid detection. Each test drive seemed to line up with the dates of earlier shootings in New Haven. This wasn't coincidence. It was rehearsal. Detectives traced Pan's movements through hotels, rental cars, and phone records. At one point, police discovered a firearm and a distinctive yellow jacket that matched descriptions from the night of the murder. Forensic tests later confirmed Pan's DNA on the weapon and ammunition. And remember Kevin's Prius, the one rear-ended before the shooting. Impressions on the bumper matched the license plate frame from Pan's SUV. Piece by piece, the case against him grew stronger. Meanwhile, Pan's parents claimed he had vanished, at one point even suggesting he might have killed himself after fleeing. But surveillance footage told another story. Cameras captured him alive, moving in and out of stores and hotels, often with the help of his parents. At a mall in Georgia, investigators spotted his father purchasing a computer, followed minutes later by a man matching Pan's description. The suicide tale had been a smokescreen. Months passed, but the marshals never let up. Finally, in May 2021, after a tense 3-month chase, Pan was captured in Alabama. He was brought back to Connecticut to face charges of murder. Court proceedings dragged on through pandemic delays, but the evidence was overwhelming. Shell casing matches, video footage, eyewitness accounts, digital trails, all pointed directly to him. In 2024, 3 years after Kevin's death, Pan pled guilty to murder. In exchange, he was sentenced to 35 years in prison without parole. In court, Kevin's family and friends faced him one last time. His mother, too heartbroken to speak, had her words read aloud. She dreamed of her son's wedding, of a life he never got to live. Through tears, she asked God for mercy, not just for Kevin, but for everyone scarred by the crime. When it was his turn, Pan finally spoke. He said he was sorry for the pain his actions caused and accepted his punishment. But his words rang hollow against the enormity of what he had done. With that, the judge handed down the sentence. Pan was led away in handcuffs, his future sealed in the same way he had tried to take Kevin's. When the trial ended and the gavel struck, justice was finally delivered, but the weight of loss remained. For Kevin Jiang's family, his friends, and the Yale community, nothing could undo the brutal February night that took his life. Kevin was remembered not for the way he died, but for the way he lived. At his funeral, his pastor spoke of a man who was deeply rooted in faith, who gave joy to others, and who never wavered in his kindness. His fiancée, Zion, read a poem Kevin had once written for her, words about love and resilience, about holding on to each other no matter what. In hindsight, those lines carried an almost haunting sense of permanence, as if Kevin's voice still lingered even after his death. His story became a reminder of how fragile life can be, and how senseless violence can rip apart something beautiful in seconds. For the Yale community, the loss of a bright, engaged student was shocking enough. But for his mother, who had raised him largely on her own and who relied on his support, the grief was immeasurable. She described feeling Kevin's presence after his passing, as if he was still urging her to keep going, not to let sadness consume her. For investigators, the case underscored just how easily obsession can turn deadly. Wan Pan had every privilege, a prestigious education, resources, and a path to success. Yet instead of building his own future, he allowed jealousy and rejection to fester into something monstrous. His decision to plan and carry out Kevin's murder destroyed not only Kevin's life but his own, and left families on both sides broken. The sentence of 35 years meant Pan would one day walk free, but by then, much of his life would be gone. For Kevin, though, there was no second chance. He was forever 26, remembered by those who loved him as a man of faith, love, and promise. In the end, this case was more than headlines. It was a story of love cut short, of a community grieving, and of a justice system piecing together truth from chaos. Kevin Jiang's life was filled with hope, joy, and possibility, and though it was stolen from him, his story lives on as a cautionary tale of how obsession can shatter lives, and how even in tragedy, a community can come together to honor what was lost.